team. Let's start the presentation. I'm going to share my screen and we'll follow across the presentation. All right. Okay. So you should be able to see my screen now.
Yes, please do see.
So the topic of today is to understand PSD2, a new European regulation, and the effect that it has on payment and checkout in a web environment. So obviously, as many of you know it, and that's why we're also here at BeCommerce, e-commerce is clearly on the rise. Today, what we see is that pretty much every European has done a digital transaction, but many of them, about a third, do it very regularly, about at least once a week. What we also notice is that the way that Europeans shop is shifting towards more and more mobile commerce, using mobile devices to shop, meaning a phone or a tablet. And that has definitely some implications on how we need to prepare and how we need to set up the way we do web commerce in the future. Also important to understand is why Mastercard is here talking to you today. Today, about 47% of all the spent on a Mastercard in Belgium are actually online transactions. That really explains why there's a strong focus on our end on making sure that the cards remain the best, the safest, and the easiest way to pay online. At the same time, and I don't think it's a surprise to anybody, with the growth of e-commerce, we've also seen the increasing growth in terms of fraud. And fraud is certainly one of the elements that is concerning the consumer. 62% of Belgians see car fraud and identity theft as one of their biggest concerns when they're shopping online. As a result, and understanding that e-commerce is poised to grow, but at the same time is an area that is still exposed to fraud, the European regulator stepped in and came up with a regulation that talks about strong customer authentication, essentially having to identify yourself before you make a transaction. I'm going to hand over to Anne for the rest of the section.
Thank you, Henri, and good morning to all. So indeed, because of security challenges with online payments, there is this new European regulation that was issued by the EBA, so the European Banking Authority, who reports into the European Commission. Meaning that since September last year, and yes, already last year, there is a new law in Europe that says that more transactions will need to go through authentication. Actually, all remote and online payments will need to be strongly authenticated. And I will explain later what exactly that is. So the date was September last year, but the actual enforcement by the local regulators, so in Belgium by the National Bank of Belgium, will start from the 1st of January 2021. So from then onwards, whenever Europeans shop online, there will be some extra levels of authentication. So meaning that you have to prove your identity, those will be required. So you can change to the next slide, please. So why is this happening? Of course, as we just mentioned, fraud numbers are not very good in the card not present space. So we want to reduce fraud with that law. E-commerce card fraud losses are a huge problem in Europe, and you see a staggering number on the slide. On the right-hand side, you also see that out of all the card fraud that we see in Europe, card not present fraud is really the biggest portion in there, 75% and rising. And as a result of those numbers, issuers are much more nervous and they will apply more stricter risk management rules, which means that in the digital environment, more transactions get declined, and you see the number there, up to 1 in 5 transactions, versus the physical face-to-face payment world. And that is, of course, a big shame too. It doesn't mean that 1 in 5 is a fraudulent transactions, but because of the stricter rules, there are more declines also of genuine transactions. And you can click. Thank you. So it's good that we join forces, the schemes, all the banks, all the parties and all the regulators to reduce fraud in the e-commerce space, but we should also be very careful and make sure that we minimize the impact on the customer experience, and with customer we mean both the consumer and the merchant. Because we see that today more or less 1 in 8 transactions require authentication or are going through authentication, whilst at the same time up to 25% of online purchases are already abandoned before they're actually completed. That is not a very good number. Moreover, if there are false declines, so an issuer declining a transaction which in the end was not fraudulent at all, this of course undermines also the trust of the consumer. And next time he may abandon his card, not even use it, or he may shop less at a particular merchant where he had the bad experience. Also, we see that more and more people are really open to embrace the new methods to prove their identity. We have biometric solutions that are now gaining more and more space, and this is really the way forward that is being recognized by most consumers. So conclusion, as a scheme, we are fully aligned to do something about online payment security, but we should at the same time ensure that the processes are smooth and that the consumers keep trust. You can click to the next slide, please. In the past, consumers could simply enter their card number and their CVC verification code, as you all probably have the experience. But now with the new law under PSD2, the Payment Systems Directive 2, more information will be required. So we'll see that on slide 11. So what does the new law say? It says that you now are required to strongly authenticate all the remote and online payment transactions. Strong customer authentication means that you have to apply authentication. It's for all online remote payments, so including the card on file transactions, meaning where the merchant keeps or stores the credentials of the card. It's also valid for mobile in-store payments, and it's also required for accessing your mobile banking application. So using 2 factors out of the following 3 categories that you see under key principle. So you have to combine 2 factors out of these 3 categories, the knowledge, possession, and inherence category. Knowledge, that means something you know. So like a PIN code, for example, is something you know, or a security question, and the answer to that is something you know. Possession is something that you have. So your mobile phone, for example, is a good one, or a very common one. But it could also be, for example, a one-time password that is being sent to you by SMS. That is also under the possession factor. A third category has to do with inherence, so something that is inherent to you yourself. So this has all to do with biometrics. It can be a fingerprint, it can be your voice, it can be your face, so a selfie pay, as we say. So all these are categories of which you have to combine 2 out of the 3, but the 2 have to be from different categories to make it strong customer authentication. You can change to the next slide. But let me, also on top of the previous slide, I want to mention that this is required for all transactions, but the law also enables some exceptions that can be applied, and Henri will explain more about that later. But what is really changing in the customer journey, and that's important, of course, for you to know, there are 2. There will be more and more step-ups required. A step-up means that you have to prove as a consumer that you are who you say you are, right? And in order to do that, you will at a certain moment have to leave the environment of the web shop, to go to the bank environment to prove your identity, and then you go back to the web environment of the merchant to confirm your purchase order. A second key change is that to make it a two-factor, so a strong authentication, you need to apply new methods. So the current methods that are being used commonly across Europe are not always compliant to this rule anymore. So you see the two ones on the right hand of the screen. So username and static password, or card data, so meaning all the data that is printed on your card in combination with a one-time password via SMS. Those two are not considered compliant by the new regulation. The other three on the left-hand side, they are compliant with the new law. But we've put one in green because this is really what we believe is the best way forward. So this is involving biometrics and mobile applications. And then you have also the card reader that is commonly used in Belgium today, and also one-time password via SMS combined with a knowledge factor, so with a PIN code or with a security question. Those two are compliant for the law, but we don't believe those two ones in the yellow boxes are offering the best user experience. Okay, and we'll come back to that later. You can go to the next slide. So why is it important to you, and what is happening after January 1st? So you can go to the next slide, please. If you as a merchant don't request authentication, or you don't indicate that you want to make use of one of the exemptions that I just referred to, then the issuer from the 1st of January onwards will have to decline your transaction. It's very important to take note of that, of course. If the issuer doesn't decline the transaction, he will get some serious penalties from the local regulator. So this is really going to happen from January onwards. You can move to the next slide, please. Luckily, we have a bit of an advantage in Belgium. Actually, there are two main advantages. First of all, we have already the experience, or most merchants have the experience of 3DS1. So 3DS1 is the protocol, the language that is used to provide this authentication. And this 3D Secure protocol in version 1 is used by most of Belgian merchants today. It is not used for every transaction, but at least all have implemented it. A second advantage in Belgium is that most cardholders, they are used to strongly authenticate it. They are used to using their card reader. But as I mentioned before, we don't believe this is the best user experience, especially now in combination with mobile payments. If you're not at your home place, if you are at a friend's place and you want to make an online payment, you probably didn't bring your card reader along. So we believe there are better ways to be able to do this. Okay. You can move to the next slide, Henri. Thank you. So it is important to note that even when you are used to 3DS1, this protocol, 3D Secure, then we believe this is not the best way forward, and it may actually hurt your business, because we see today already that from the 1 in 8 authenticated transactions throughout Europe, up to 25% is being abandoned, so not leading to good conversion for the merchant. These are lost transactions. If we now apply these events to what is going to happen in the future, so after the 1st of January, with much higher volumes of authentication, also this abandonment rate will proportionally evolve, and that is of course not what we want. But it's not all doom and gloom. Henri will tell you how and enlighten you on what you can do to make sure that this all moves on in the best way.
Thank you, Anne. So let's talk a little bit about that. First, a little bit of an explanation on 3DS. So 3DS, which is the protocol to authenticate and to enable a strong customer authentication. It's essentially the rails that are used today to enable you to identify yourself, mostly using the card reader or a one-time password. What we did as an industry is that we've developed a new protocol, an enhancement of the current protocol, which we call EMV3DS. And this new protocol is adapted to more ways of payment, including some of the more modern and advanced ways of identifying yourself. But it's also really built to leverage as much as possible the opportunities that give the new European regulation. In terms of how the flow works, at the top here, you can notice that you have the cardholder and the merchant that meet each other on the website. And in a physical world, the cardholder will have his card issued by a bank, which is here at the bottom, which could be in Belgium, you know, BNP, KBC, ING, or many others. And on the merchant side, the merchant is using a terminal which is acquired by another financial institution. In Belgium, we have acquirers such as Worldline, CVC, or Europa Bank, for example. In the virtual world, when you actually talk about a web shop, there is no terminal. And the way to identify yourself, which usually is a PIN code, is not really possible when you're talking about a web transaction. And that's why this orange flow was developed with a directory server here in the middle. And what that essentially does is when you do the transaction, instead of putting in your PIN to identify yourself, what you have to do is identify yourself through another mean. And the merchant therefore does a connection, usually to its PSP, with this box, which is a directory server. And the directory server essentially links my card number with a way to identify myself. So it will basically say this card number is identified with either a card reader, with an SMS to identify myself, or why not with mobile biometrics, which are linked to the device. And this new flow is what we've now adapted with a new protocol that is used by the merchant to enhance the identification. So why upgrade from 3DS if you already have it to EMV3DS? Well, it's important to understand that with the new regulation, there will be more of a push to identify consumers. And where today, it's roughly, 1/3 of the transactions that are being pushed to authentication, we expect that that number will at least double. So many, many more authentications will happen come January 1st. And which says many more authentications says many more opportunities to have a checkout that is abandoned or dropped because something goes wrong with the authentication. So that's why we really believe that as a web shop, you need to think about upgrading to EMV3DS. What that will do is, firstly, it will avoid that your transaction gets declined if you're not using 3DS today. That's really a minority of shops in Belgium, but there are still about 20% of shops that do not use 3DS. If they don't do anything, as of January, essentially all of their transactions will be declined. That's why we're really saying here, get on the bandwagon and use EMV3DS. If you're already using 3DS, you can increase your approval rates, make them better based on the new protocol, and I'll explain how. The second reason is that we're obviously continuously innovating in terms of making and web commerce easier. And to support the latest technologies, you're going to need EMV3DS, which makes a lot of this possible. And then finally, for those of you who would like to have a frictionless flow, meaning the possibility to have a transaction without identifying or authenticating yourself, there is a possibility with EMV3DS to do that using exemptions or delegated authentication. The first point is increasing approval rates. What we did with the new version of 3DS, EMV3DS, is that we allowed merchants to share more information directly with the issuer. And there's essentially more than 10 times more data that can be moved from the merchant to the issuer. We're essentially creating a highway of information between those two, so that the issuer, the bank who's authorizing the transaction, has much more data elements to understand whether this transaction is a genuine transaction or potentially a fraudulent transaction. For example, when the merchant is able to give to the issuer the information that the billing address and the shipping address are the same, that will increase the level of confidence of the issuer and therefore the approval, the chances of having a positive approval. So this is really a benefit which we believe will drive the approval rates of EMV 3DS much higher than the current version of 3DS. The second reason is that it will support the latest technologies, such as wallets, for example, Apple Pay, in-app transaction or mobile payments. And in the future, we'll also roll out our own version of a PayPal-like experience, which we call one-click checkout. So all of these new developments, which will increase the approval rates and increase the likelihood of a successful web commerce transaction, will be possible on EMV 3DS and not on the current environment. And that's the second reason why we really, encourage everybody to move over to the new version. Thirdly, there's the frictionless flow. So frictionless flow means that you're actually not subject at all to an authentication. And taking a little bit of a step back here, we told you that the European regulation basically forced all transaction into authentication, with potential challenges when it comes to abandonment rates. And this regulation has been out there for a while. And what happened is that the merchant associations and the big merchants actually lobbied very strongly to allow frictionless flow where the risk associated with such a transaction, the risk of fraud, is low. And there's three pillars on which the merchant can rely to get to a frictionless flow. The first one is transaction risk analysis. And what that means is that you have essentially to prove that you are a business which inherently has very low fraud rates. And if you can prove that, working with your acquirer, you can essentially send transactions with a message that will indicate to the issuer that this transaction comes from a trusted environment and therefore that it can go through without authenticating yourself. A second possibility is recurring payments, or what we call merchant-initiated transactions. For example, subscriptions. Why? Because these we call out of bound, which means that the cardholder is actually not there to make an authentication. So if you have a subscription to, for example, Spotify or Netflix, every month there's going to be a charge to your card account. Obviously, you're not there when that transaction happens. And therefore, there's an exception that allows these transactions to go through without an authentication. And then finally, there's low value transactions. Transactions between 30 euros in practice are not subject to authentication. But what you have to understand is that there is a counter, meaning that a bank cannot authorize low value transactions forever. They need to count the number of transactions and they need to count a cumulative amount. So every 5 transactions, or if the cumulative amount exceeds 100, a strong customer authentication will be forced. So in many cases, transactions between 30 euros can go through, but once in a while, they will be subject to an authentication. This is very comparable to what's happening today in contactless transaction, when you're using the NFC on the plastic card. Most of the time, the transaction goes through, but once in a while, you hit a counter and then you need to do your PIN. It's here exactly the same thing. Most of the time it will go through, but once in a while you will hit the counter limit and an authentication will be required. Our expectation is that merchants successfully using these exemptions can actually lead to about 1/3 of the e-com transactions not being subject to an authentication. And we believe that's a real value here for merchants that should be exploited to the maximum, because it's going to assure this frictionless flow, which we know really increases the success of a card checkout. Another possibility is actually to use authentication on the device itself. One of the possibilities with EMV3DS is to use something that we call delegated authentication, which means that the authentication actually happens directly on the iPhone or the Android phone, using things like Face ID or fingerprint recognition. Big advantage is that the consumer stays 100% within the environment of the web merchant, which means that you are fully in control of the experience. At the same time, the issuer is going to be liable in case of fraud, which is an increased advance for the merchant. What we really believe is that the fraud on these transactions will be exceptionally low because they all will be authenticated, not by the issuer, but directly by the consumer on the device, which we know is also an excellent way of reaching a frictionless or pretty frictionless transaction. One thing to understand is that there are some requirements here, and for example, your PSP would need to be certified to enable these device-based biometrics, such as Face ID. In terms of next steps, I will give the hand back to Anne.
Yes, thank you, Henri. Indeed, there are some next steps, and these are actually next steps for you. So I apologize up front, but yes, this is a webinar with some homework to do. So if today you are not requesting any authentications at any time, so there's no SCA taking place that is being initiated from your side, then indeed there is no hassle for the consumer. This is quite easy. It's a frictionless flow. You saw the fraud numbers and they are growing. So it's not a good situation to be in. Furthermore, from the 1st of January onwards, this will not be a compliant flow anymore. So this is a first takeaway. If you're in the situation with your provider that you are commonly using 3DS1, so the special format to do strong customer authentication, that is good, but we told you about the challenges we currently experience with the high abandonment rate because mainly of inconvenience to the consumer, but also because this format is not geared up for the latest payment technologies like wallets, like biometrics. We believe this might result in some further challenges, and it will proportionally grow because there will be more challenges asked after January 1st, and not more. Normally it's 100% step up, because also in version 3DS1 you will not be able to benefit from the exemptions that the law provides in. So if you're in the third situation and your PSP is already fully prepared to work with EMV3DS, that is a very good thing, of course, but then you have to make sure that it is also activated in your checkout pages. And then indeed the consumers will be able to identify themselves using also more user-friendly methods, also when they're not at home, maybe somewhere else via their mobile payments. With biometrics, they can also authenticate via wallets. And very importantly, you will be able to also benefit from these frictionless flows thanks to the exceptions to the rules. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so what do you really need to do before the 1st of January? And I would say from tomorrow onwards, contact your PSP if you're not using authentication requests yet, to make sure that your PSP upgrades to EMV3DS. And also contact your acquirer and your PSP, so both, to check with them if you're eligible for using these exemptions and being able to avoid a challenge, a step up. Okay. If you are using commonly 3DS1 today, then also contact your PSP to make sure he upgrades to the next version, and then contact both PSP and acquirer to see if he can start using these exemptions to have a better consumer experience. If you are already with a PSP working with the EMV3DS, then still speak with him, please, and also with your acquirer to see if you can make use of the exemptions to the law, and also start testing in high volumes before the enforcement in January. This is also a key instruction. Today, we only see across Europe like 3% of merchants that are testing. This is too low because typically we find that it takes 2 to 3 months to iron out all the issues. So to detect them, to come across problems, and to make sure that they're being resolved between merchant, PSP, acquirer, and the rest of the flow. So it's important, we are October now, that you start today. Also, there's no further excuse to wait because the issuers, they have fully migrated more or less. In Belgium, 90% of all the cards have migrated to EMV3DS. They are enrolled. Across Europe, that number is now 85%. So there is no need to wait. You can start testing and practicing now. We can move to the next slide, please. And in order to help you with testing, Mastercard also provides a free of charge testing platform. You can see the link on this page. You can always contact us as well if you want more information about it. But actually we work with an ACS, so that's the access control server, the PSP of the issuer bank. So this is a test ACS, if you like, called Netcetera. And via this test ACS, you can go through a set of 19 different use cases to test if you are fully compliant with PSD2. So whether you're ready for the 1st of January. And those use cases cover frictionless flows, they cover challenged flows, they cover testing all these acquirer exemptions that we talked about. They will also test the authentication delegation. All the different use cases are included in there. So from a scheme perspective, we will also monitor the evolution, of course. We will also keep an eye on how merchants are evolving. If we see that error rates are above 1%, we will make sure that we contact your acquirers and request to go through a testing scenario with Mastercard. So in order to register on this link that you see on the slide, the Netcetera link for free testing, you will only need your acquirer BIN, you will need to know your merchant ID, and you will have to provide contact details. That is all that is required. We also provide a best practice guide, so you see the reference of that as well. And we have, of course, a mailbox where you can send specific questions to. So don't wait, there's not a lot of time left. Here is all the material that you need to proceed. But please, first of all, contact your PSPs and your acquirers. And I think that's also on the next slide. Exactly. So contact your PSPs and acquirers to confirm readiness, but as mentioned, also to check whether you can leverage the benefit of these exceptions to the rules. Start testing now. That's the second homework. And also start replacing your current 3DS1 volumes by EMV3DS transactions so that you can still fine-tune the whole flow before the 1st of January, when there will be no further delay. So we're concluding, I think, in less than an hour with this webinar, but of course we give a chance for questions as well. And also we want to give you the maximum of time to get ready for the next phase in the e-commerce world. So I hope next time that I log in on one of your websites, that I will be able to initiate an EMV3DS transactions where it will be a safer experience, but at the same time also a convenient experience from a consumer point of view and a better conversion for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is the last slide, Anne and Henry?
Correct.
Yes.
Yes, it is the last slide.
I thank you a lot. You actually passed the key message that is for the consumer most important, the security and convenience. And that's why e-commerce is on the rise. And that's why we need the payment industry to move on together with all the web shops. And I did hear you. I think it's a very important message you gave, that this frictionless experience is super important. So this webinar has been recorded, and we will put it available to our community through the BeCommerce account. We will definitely wrap up also and take out a few of those slides which we think were the most important and which really are a call to action. And then we will see also how we can spread the message and outside the community, because that's why we are partners, of course, to reach the e-commerce community at large, and not only the BeCommerce community, but the larger ecosystem of e-commerce. But again, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Maybe I give quickly the floor to the participants. Are there any questions from your side? I see Anne, I see Luc. Scott, please go ahead if you have questions.
Yeah, Luc. Just Henri or Anne, perhaps you can share some of the early results that you see with merchants who have migrated. I believe there are interesting results that go perhaps beyond the imagination in terms of improving the authentication and the authorization.
Correct. So there are still challenges on both sides in the ecosystem. So even when we see that merchants have made the necessary changes through their PSPs and their acquirers, there may still be challenges with the risk management setup on the issuer side. So, but they need to get the volumes and the experience as well to make sure they can fine-tune their rules. So that is one thing. On the other hand, we see, and that is one of the key challenges, that on the merchant side, merchants are not ready to respond to a decline. It's called a soft decline from the issuer side. And so issuers will soft decline when they get a transaction not in the 3DS flow, so directly into the authorization. They will soft decline this, meaning please redirect this into the proper 3DS flow, and then it sort of goes lost, that transaction, instead of being represented in the 3DS flow. So this is really an action point towards the merchant community that needs to be resolved as soon as possible, and at the very latest by the 1st of January. I don't know, Henri, if you want to.
Yeah, I'd like to add something, is that what we also notice is that you're going through teething pains, right? You're going through a number of weeks and months where everybody's adapting their system and fine-tuning their system. But the first indications of the 3DS transactions that we're seeing, the new EMV 3DS transaction that we're seeing, is that the approval rates there, as we predicted, can be higher than 3DS1. And you're clearly seeing the benefit of this new technology once you're past the teething pains. So really merchants can get a much better result at the end of the tunnel, but it's really important that everybody does the hard work of passing through the tunnel before seeing the light at the end of it. So that's really our message here is, get on board with EMV 3DS, work with your PSP or acquirer through this initial setup period. But at the end of it, the results are going to be better than the current flow. And that's what we all want, better transactions, safer transactions, and easier transactions.
That was very clear. And yeah, I think everyone has to go through an effort. That's exactly, it's
new to everybody.
There's no such thing as a free lunch. You have to go through it to improve your operations and your customer experience and your chiffre d'affaires finalement, your turnover. So there is no such thing as a free lunch. So each of us has to make an investment, and we will do our part and encourage our community to go to this test. I find this very interesting that you have a link where you can actually have more than 90 different use cases and trial and error, and take this 3 months time to get through the process. Yes. Any other question from your side, from the participants, or any other thing you want to add to conclude the session? then I'm thanking again everyone, especially Anne and Henri, but also all the participants. And then we will get together with follow-up how we will communicate this through a larger public and through our community again afterwards.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you.
I'm wishing everyone a nice day.
And you.
Have a great day, all.
It's a rainy day, but we
Yes.
are inside, and so make the best of it. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.